continue with your meal while you hear our speakers. After the main course is removed, the dessert will be served. Hopefully it will be served finally, so that we can continue on with the presentations afterward. We're very happy and honored today to have some very distinguished speakers to give you further perspective on where the U.S. government is and where the region is in regard to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, especially in light of the President's speech last Thursday. To open the presentation to you now at the end of lunch, we will start with my friend Wilcox, former Consul General of Jerusalem, former Assistant Secretary of State for Counterterrorism, and currently the head of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Phil and I are also classmates. Phil will talk about the U.S. position as it is now, followed by two other distinguished speakers, if you will introduce. Phil?
Thank you, Warren. And thank you all for coming. I have to confess that we had hoped that maybe Hillary Clinton or President Obama could come to address that. But when they couldn't, Warren asked me if I would fill the breach. But I will not speak on behalf of the administration, although I must say that is a more enviable and easier thing to do these days than it has been for years. I am a retired U.S. government servant, but it's now been almost 10 years, and I finally feel totally liberated. We have an hour and a half, and that, of course, raises the risk that maybe we'll talk for too long. I hope we can reserve much of our time for your comments and questions. And I remember a story that George Bush Sr. once told about a luncheon speaker who droned on for an hour, and then an hour and 15 minutes, then an hour and a half, and finally a gentleman stood up from the front row, and he pointed to the master of ceremonies, and he started heckling the speaker, heckling, and the speaker went on for another 20 minutes, and the heckling continued, and he turned to the master of ceremonies and said, "Stop that heckler, he's disturbing the flow of my speech." And so the master of ceremonies threw his gavel at him, and he hit him right between the eyes and knocked him cold. He fell underneath the table, so the speaker went on for another half hour. And the heckler regained consciousness. He pulled himself up to his feet and said, hit me again, I can still hear him." I want to thank Warren Clark, Julie Schumacher-Cohen, the terrific, small, hard-working staff of the Church for Middle East Peace, and all of you supporters for the terrific work that you have been doing on behalf of a just and secure peace for Israel and Palestine. Your voice as America's largest and most influential ecumenical Christian group is tremendously important. And it's heartening to see the progress that CMEP has made here in Washington over the years, and its loud, rising voice and impact toward our policy. It is, I think, a reflection of an even larger movement within the American Christian community of mainstream liberal, progressive, and conservative Christians, whose voice has often been drowned out by a more strident and non-representative voice from the Christian right about this issue, peace in the Middle East. So that's a great thing. The strength of the Christian voice is again demonstrated today. The letter that some of you may have from 50 leading American clergymen advocating peace for supporting the Obama administration. So things are moving in the right direction. And I can say that having worked on this problem for some 25 years in and out of government. I am more encouraged than I've been in a long, long time about the direction of our policy under President Barack Obama. Judging from the appointment of the distinguished mediator, George Mitchell, soon after the inauguration, the beginning of real serious diplomacy, and President Obama's stunning speech in Cairo last week, it looks to me like this administration is moving toward a much more promising and effective American policy. This new policy, I am sure, is going to be made in Washington. And it will be based first and foremost on American national security interests. And of course, the fundamental interests of our friends, the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Arab states in the Middle East. That's not to say that the U.S. is going to abandon its long and important traditional support for Israel, but that it will, for the first time in many years, also commit itself in equal measure to the well-being of the Palestinian people. The President has made it clear that America's commitment to the state of Israel is unshakable, but I think he was in his speech in Cairo and in his actions, I believe, he will be no less supportive for the goal of justice, security, and freedom for the Palestinian people. He has too few American leaders have acknowledged a simple truth, that the future of these two societies is interdependent, that to meet their mutual fundamental needs, that is peace and security for Israel in the kind of state that its founders envisaged, and self-determination, sovereignty, liberation, and dignity for the Palestinians are absolutely interdependent. They are now syncing together, and it's the task of groups like ours to help them recover from this disaster so that they can swim together as two states living side by side in peace. The recognition of this interdependence, the fact that America must be not only pro-Israel, but pro-Palestine, and that the two are interdependent, it will be the basis, I think, for an even-handed and fair American policy. And this is a kind of conceptual breakthrough. It hasn't always been that way. The President has also said, it sounds like a truism, but he said that friends must speak the truth to each other, and that we need candor and honesty in our relations with the two protagonists. That hasn't always been the case either. Our relations with Israel have too often been described in elliptical, evasive terms, and alas, I can attest to the fact that our diplomacy in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict too often has been limp-wristed and unsuccessful. So President Obama's new diplomacy, judging from what he has done and said so far, is a blast of fresh air. Friends are expected to tell other friends the truth, and I believe that our President, our Secretary of State, and their team are beginning to do that. The President, I think, wants to use the special relationship between the United States and Israel as it ought to be used, not as an excuse for deferring to any and all Israeli policies, but to tell them the truth, to help them out of a tragic mess while we also help Palestinians. That in no way will undermine our commitment to Israel's security, as the President said. One of the areas where we need much more candor is the problem of Israeli settlements. And from the beginning, the President and his team have talked about this massive problem of Israeli settlements that stands in the way of a two-state solution. He even said in Cairo, after using the word occupation, something that is not often used in our discourse here, that he does not consider continued Israeli settlement legitimate. Now that's a new departure from the wobbly language that we've used in the past about settlements. The President spoke with compassion about the tragic history of the Jewish people, the Holocaust, and he acknowledged with no less empathy the victimization of the Palestinians. He also said, and this is important, that violence by the Palestinians or any other party is unacceptable, that violence is a futile and immoral weapon for resolving conflict. Now, if we are committed to impartiality, fairness, and balance, I think all of us Americans are going to stop playing the blame game. Stop trying to draw a balance sheet of that party who has a monopoly or a majority of virtue. History has happened. It's been a tragic history. Both of these people have deep equities. There is a paradox between the struggle for justice for the Jewish people and the struggle for justice for the Palestinian people. We live with paradox all the time, and let's forget about deciding who is right and who is wrong. They have been wrong, both of them, over the years. We have been wrong as well. Let's fix the problem and rescue two people who have been victims of tragic history. Well, words are important, and we should try to develop a new vocabulary that avoids the kind of demonization, denial of the tragedy, the victimization of the other side that has been so common and which has crippled honest and useful debate and discussion in this country. Now, I don't mean to say that the darkness has lifted and the dawn is here. The situation is very bad in the occupied territories, West Bank and Gaza. There are now some 290,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank. Gaza has suffered a catastrophic damage in the recent war. There is no effective reconstruction program and only enough humanitarian supplies are coming in to provide life support. This is a totally unacceptable situation in Gaza. The the dominant, aggressive settlement project in the West Bank must be reversed, and that is a formidable task. The Prime Minister of Israel, moreover, has said that he does not accept even the concept of a Palestinian state, and that he is determined to support the continued growth of settlements. On the other side, the Palestinians themselves are deeply divided between Hamas and Fatah. They are engaged in a power struggle, which is undermining the Palestinian nationalist cause. To be sure, the State of Israel and the former government of the United States had a hand in fomenting and encouraging this unity. But the Palestinians, unfortunately, have played into the hands of this divide and conquer policy. And until they can resolve their internal differences and reunite into a respectable single Palestinian government that can deal effectively with Israel and with the rest of the world, it's hard to see how they can win their objective of freedom. The United States has not yet defined its views on how this other problem, the Palestinian disunity, is to be resolved. Well, I think the new administration policy is just beginning. It's a work in progress. I hope that at some stage the Obama administration will announce a broader vision of a two-state peace and what its ingredients in terms of borders, settlements, Jerusalem, refugees, and security will look like. I think that's necessary in place of the ineffectual peace processes that we have pursued in the past. President Obama and George Mitchell, I think, are committed to success, and I think they both realize that in the last 15 years, efforts to try to create a better environment, confidence building through piecemeal measures, through a step-by-step process, have failed miserably. So I hope and indeed expect something bolder. Now, the President, if he is to follow through in this extraordinary task, and I say extraordinary because it means a transformation of Israeli and Palestinian politics, a totally new political landscape in those two countries. He's going to need all the help he can get from the American public. And that's why the work of Churches for Middle East Peace and its fellow groups, Jewish, Arab American, and Muslim American, who support a two-state peace, is tremendously important. This is a democratic country. All of our politicians have to keep a weather eye out for public opinion if they're going to succeed. And that is why your constant affirmation of the right policies and advocacy for continued progress is very, very important. Your voice can make a difference. The Churches for Middle East Advocacy machinery on its website, which all of you read, I think, so you should read it. Every one of those appeals for your expression of support, to sign letters, to send messages are very, very important. It's easy to do, so don't miss this opportunity because your messages are being read and they count. That's the way our system works. Someone said the U.S. government is designed to be lobbied, and it has been lobbied, often to the disadvantage of public policy because the lobbies who work hardest, are best funded, and the most aggressive do not reflect the wishes of the American people. That's why it's so important that all of us work harder with other messages, and I know you're doing it. And I'm encouraged by the growing community of Jewish, Christian, and Arab American peace organizations. I'm sure they represent the silent majority of American public opinion toward the Israel-Palestinian conflict. They are beginning to coalesce, but there's a lot more work to be done. Well, these are exciting times. There is, at long last, a real hope for change. And all of you should feel pleased and proud at the role that you're playing in this process. I'm going to have the pleasure now of introducing a friend and colleague, Amjad Atallah. Amjad is a lawyer from Akron, or Dayton, Ohio? Gary, yeah. Outside of the Beltway. Nevertheless, he has been a fresh and wise voice in the conversation in Washington about Middle East peace. He has a long background in conflict resolution, having worked in the Balkans, having worked in Darfur. He is now a fellow and co-director of the Middle East project of the Foundation for the New America. Amjad's colleague is Daniel Levy. Daniel's train was delayed from New York, but I predict that the train is still stuck. He'll get off the train and get a taxi to be here. But in the meantime, let me introduce Amjad, who will speak for a moment. Then Daniel's here, he'll speak. If not, we can have a discussion. Amjad.
I wanted to see if that greeting would work as well here as it did in Cairo. And Susan, it has. It's actually important to realize how important it was for an American president to sit in front of the entire Muslim world and for his first words in formal greeting to be, "Peace be upon you." That has not been the United States message in the past. Peace was not being sprinkled liberally upon the Middle East. And it doesn't reflect only a tonal change. It reflects, I believe, a deep-seated desire on the part of the Muslim world to hear that message from the United States. Contrary to the clash of civilization stereotype, that theme is, in fact, I think one of the most dominant ones in the Muslim world. That of wanting respect from the United States, but wanting also to be able to love the United States, to have the intellect appreciate the emotional feeling of support for the United States that so many people in the region have. Now, having said that, I'm nervous because Phil started the introduction, and I appreciate Phil's comments and his introduction, but he told you about speakers who went on too long, and then hecklers and throwing their gavels, etc. So if you start heckling me, I promise I'll stop. And I'm not going to try to pick up Daniel's time. If Daniel doesn't show up by the time I finish my comments, I think it'll be useful to have a conversation rather than continue. I also want to thank the Churches for Middle East Peace for hosting this. I'm also very glad that it's at Galileo University. I think that the work that's being done by CMEP is very important, and I'm going to hopefully by the time I finish my comments let you realize just how urgently important it is. I do believe that there's a time frame involved here that we're going to have to accommodate, and it's not just for CMEP, but also for all of us who've been working on this issue for so long. Now, I was going to call my talk "Is Failure Reversible?" The United States has, without a doubt, failed in its Middle East policy on almost every front over the course of the last decades. It's not just a failure that was only with the Bush administration, but the Bush administration effectively accented it and then buried American national security interests in the sands of the desert of the Middle East. And the question becomes, is this irretrievable? Well, if there's any place that we can have a resurrection, it's right. That idea is, and Daniel's arrived, good. And if that's actually anything, it's an American storyline, isn't it? It's when we watch movies, when we read our books that we love so much, it's always about hope overcoming experience. You may be jaded and cynical, etc., but at the end of the movie, everything always works out. No matter what the odds are, the underdog comes up from behind and succeeds. Well, if we're going to have peace in the Holy Land, there's going to have to be an American script, and not an Israeli script or a Palestinian script, to what this movie is going to look like. And I'll tell you one of the reasons. Daniel and I just came back, actually, from Israel, and we visited the West Bank, and I got into Gaza. Daniel had to stand at the border and watch me. The scripts that the Israelis and the Palestinians are writing for themselves are not conducive to peace. They're not conducive to ending this conflict. The Israeli script is one based not only on victimization, and I might say from a lot of the people we met, paranoia, but and you can argue whether historically there's a justification for that feeling today or not, but the problem is that it's based on an assumption of continual conflict. It's based on an assumption that Israel must always be in conflict with its neighbors. Israel must always be at war in order to defend itself. The idea that Israel could in fact be at peace with every Arab country is viewed as a delusional fantasy by most people. Even when the Arabs offer it, it's difficult for Israelis to imagine that this is real or that it's acceptable. It's a fundamental problem of being able to take yes for an answer. And so on the Israeli side, the script is a very negative one that's based on a continuation of conflict. On the Palestinian side, it's a heavily victimized, heavily traumatized storyline in which the Palestinians are yet again the subject of European colonization and European attempt to take over land and resources, and that the only way to liberate and to end this conflict is going to be through the resistance. It was resistance that liberated Algeria from French occupation. Nobody here will remember, but France actually considered Algeria part of metropolitan France. Algeria was part of France. It just happened to be that the Arabs, who were Muslims and Christians in Algeria, were not allowed to have, the Muslims were not allowed to have French citizenship. And so everybody back in the Middle East still remembers these storylines. They still remember these narratives of resistance overcoming colonization. And for a lot of people, for a lot of Palestinians, that storyline ultimately ends up being the one that they think will ultimately succeed in achieving their rights. Now, in both of those scripts, American national security interests get destroyed. In both of those scripts, American national security interests suffer. In both of those scripts, Palestinians and Israelis continue to suffer. In both of those scripts, Jerusalem continues to be not a coveted sacred city for all three faiths, but becomes a prized possession to be jealously held by only one. And so an American script needs to be presented that actually can override those two very negative scripts. And I think, in fact, I'm more convinced than ever that both Israelis and Palestinians are ready to see an American script. One of the things that surprised me when on our trip is that almost every Israeli we met, except from those of the government, and almost every Palestinian that we met said that they expected the United States to say, they expected, when we were in Gaza, Palestinians would come up to us and say, they would literally say, when are you going to say this? When are you creating the state? When are you? And who's you? It was Obama. The expectation that their own leadership is physically and intellectually incapable of delivering independence seems to have sunk in to the level of 15-year-olds on the streets of the Gaza Strip. And the expectation that the United States is the one that's going to be able to do this. So there's great promise in that, but there's also great peril if we don't deliver. It's worse than if we had never promised that we were going to make peace. It's worse than if we had never promised that we were fair and just. It's worse than if we had never promised that we belonged and had our own vested interests in the region. So, the chance for peace today, in my opinion, doesn't rest in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or Ramallah or the Gaza Strip. It rests here in the United States, and it rests with our president. But it also rests with the Americans who are going to side with him. And it rests with those who are going to side with Likud and Lieberman and the Shas party in Israel, because they're in Washington as well, and they're mobilizing as well. So that's why the work of all of you here today is not only important, it's extraordinarily urgent. Now, why is it that I'm placing such an emphasis on the United States and our role and on President Obama's efforts? Well, let me give you an audit of current dynamics in the Middle East, at least on the Arab side. I'll let Daniel talk more about the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, I don't think you could have summarized it better than with President Abbas's visit here. Now, in all honesty, for the sake of disclosure, I actually advised President Abbas in the past in the peace negotiations. And so, I don't want to be disingenuous in my criticism of the performance of the Palestinian leadership when they were here, but it did summarize everything that was wrong with what the Palestinian national leadership is trying to accomplish. He forgot to mention the Gaza Strip when he was speaking with the president, when he was speaking publicly with the president. He forgot to mention the suffering of 1.5 million Palestinians who are under a blockade and under a siege. And even when he was told repeatedly in advance that if he doesn't do that, it's going to play into messages back in Palestine that he in fact supports the siege of the Gaza Strip. When he was interviewed when he was talking to the editorial board of the Washington Post, he noted that he was waiting for Hamas to come to accept the quartet terms, and he was going to wait for Netanyahu to accept Obama's terms, and he was going to wait, and things in Ramallah weren't so bad, and he could wait. And we were in Ramallah when he was saying these things, and I can tell you the Palestinians in Ramallah didn't think the situation was so rosy and so hunky-dory that they could sit around and wait and wait and wait. Now, maybe for the Palestinian leadership in the West, in Ramallah, things were okay, but they weren't for the overarching public. So what's effectively happened is that the Palestinian national leadership has effectively lost the Palestinian nationalist narrative. It claims to speak on behalf of the Palestinian people, but it can't articulate a message that they would recognize or that they would resonate as being one of their own. I attended for the first time in a very long time, sad to say, Friday prayers in Jerusalem at the Dome of the Rock and the Messer Blackstone. And there was a very good sermon about a son's responsibility to his parents, which I took my father with me, and he appreciated that part. And then the next part of the sermon, he talked about the peace, and he talked about the failure of a Palestinian representation for Palestinians in the diaspora, for Palestinians in refugee camps, for Palestinians inside Israel, and that there was nobody to represent them. And because there was nobody to represent them, it was the religious and moral obligation of every individual Palestinian to represent them. Now, you don't have to agree or disagree, but the point is that's a very cogent message that fits into a Palestinian nationalist narrative that the people listening to the speech can grab onto and listen to. So, in short, the people in Ramallah have become so divorced from the situation that they're living in themselves that I think it's created an obstacle to them playing the lead role, not a role, but to play the lead role in making a peace agreement. Gaza and Hamas. Well, let me just describe Gaza very quickly to you. And I want to, Tom New is here from Friends of UNRWA, and I want to thank UNRWA for all of its great work in Gaza. In fact, the only reason Gaza is not completely starving and there aren't pictures of people dying in the street is because of two people. It's because of UNRWA, two groups, UNRWA and Hamas. And UNRWA is doing it while presenting and teaching and educating people with values that we would find consistent with those that we have here in the United States. Hamas maybe not necessarily the same way, But the truth of the matter is that the blockade on Gaza is strengthening Hamas inside Gaza, but weakening Palestinian society inside Gaza. Gaza is about 1.5 million people, and 50% of them are under the age of 15. Just think about it for a second. The first thing that hits you when you enter Gaza City is that there are children everywhere. There are children everywhere. It's like some science fiction movie. It's like a country without adults. There are children everywhere. They're coming back from school. They're going to school. They're playing ball in the street. They're everywhere. And all of these kids have known nothing but war. Every one of these children, every single one of them is suffering from some form of post-traumatic stress. Now, anybody who thinks, whether Palestinian, Israeli, or American, that starving these children is a moral and a proper policy in order to affect political change, I think that falls into the category of terrorism. I think that falls into the category of targeting civilians in order to accomplish a political aim, and I'm as opposed to it as I would be of suicide bombing. I think all of us need to be as opposed to it as we would be to suicide bombing. Now, let's talk then about the Palestinian cabinet, because the people who came here when President Abbas came here were effectively representing the PLO. They weren't representing the new Palestinian cabinet that was picked in Ramallah. That cabinet is effectively an implementing agent for international agencies to feed and to pay salaries for Palestinians. It's composed of very admirable people. It's composed of very good people led by Saddam Fayyad, and it has no constituency whatsoever in the West Bank. It is an implementing arm of the international effort to feed Palestinians in the West Bank, and to that extent it's necessary and it's good and it should continue, but it doesn't have a constituency. Now, Phil said when we were talking, under these circumstances, unless there's Palestinian unity, Palestinians are not going to be able to and here, Phil, I'm going to disagree with you in nuance. When we were trying to end the war in Bosnia, we did not have a good slate of characters to negotiate with. Tudjman, the president of Croatia, was a fascist in the classical European sense of the word. You could walk around markets in Zagreb, as I did, and you could find swastikas being sold next to tokens of the Virgin Mary. It was an openly anti-Semitic, openly anti-Muslim, openly fascist government. Milosevic was, of course, responsible for the genocide and the ethnic cleansing in the first place, and was no sweetheart, no easy person to negotiate with. And you had a Bosnian government, which was secular, pluralistic, and democratic, and trying to hold its own, but also was weak and didn't actually possess control over much of the territory that they were trying to defend. But President Clinton, when he decided to end that battle, didn't say, well, let's first work on trying to get the best Croatian government we can get so that we can get an understanding. Let's not work on regime change with Milosevic until we can. He actually said, no, the war has to end. We have an American overriding national necessity. The war is going to end. We're going to end the war. I don't care who's in power, we're going to end the war. And that's the attitude we're going to have right now. It's too late to continue waiting for the perfect Israeli government or for the perfect Palestinian government. The United States is going to need to end this war. And once we end this war, we will see, just as we have in the Balkans, democratic, secular leadership develop in those societies, multi-ethnic leadership develop in those societies. It didn't happen in Croatia before the end of the war. It happened in Croatia after the end of the war. And it didn't happen, and it still is a process that's ongoing in Serbia, but it didn't happen during the war. It only was able to happen after, not only that war, but after the Kosovo War. Now, one of the difficulties I think that we're having is that people are having trouble making the switch from the Bush era, and I include Palestinians in the region on this. The idea of the Bush administration was that we could keep the situation on the ground from blowing up by feeding people, by trying to expand freedom of movement. Let's have an extra lane at Colombia, checkpointing between Ramallah and Jerusalem. Let's make things a little bit easier. Tony Blair is working diligently to open up a door in the wall around Bethlehem so that he could allow Christian tourists in, but Palestinian Christians, unfortunately, will still have to use the Palestinian door, which is going to be hours and hours for them if they can't get in or get out. Now, that kind of an attitude we have to make a fundamental break with. We have to make a fundamental shift in our attitude from that concept to the concept that we're going to have to end this conflict. And then by ending this conflict, we improve the security, economic, and social situation for the people, both Israelis and Palestinians. Now, there's also been a change with the Arab world, of course, because the Arab world now wants to make peace with Israel. There's been a change. The Arab world did not in the past. The Arab world benefited from a continuation of the conflict. However, at a certain point in time, it became obvious that the Arab governments were not able to liberate Palestine. And the only way that they could justify and provide legitimacy for the single issue that their public cared about the most was by arguing that their relationship with the United States would conclude the occupation of Palestinian territory. And when that didn't happen, it delegitimized them further. Yes, they're undemocratic. Yes, they may not be representative because they don't have elections, etc. But on top of that, they don't have legitimacy because they're unable to end this particular conflict. And so, at a certain point in time, under the leadership mostly of Saudi Arabia, there was a shift and an attitude that, okay, in the best way, in fact, to secure our own legitimacy is by making peace with Israel. But the only way we're going to make peace with Israel is if we end Israel's occupation of not only the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but I include East Jerusalem in that. That's a big change. Now, on the left to their own devices, this basically means that we have an Israeli government that's in the final months of completing the colonization of the West Bank. And if you look at what they're doing in Jerusalem, you'll know what I mean by in the next few months. You have Arab governments pleading for them to stop. You have resistance movements like Hamas and Hezbollah claiming that only violence can secure Palestinian freedom. You have a PLO that no longer exists except in name, and you have a PA that's better at delivering funds but has no constituency or ability to influence Israel. So the only ingredient in this, the only catalyst in this that could change this all around is the United States. The demand by President Obama for a settlement freeze, and then here, I don't know if Daniel will take credit for this, I'm going to give Daniel credit for this. Daniel's been saying for 2 or 3 weeks now, since the president insisted that there has to be a settlement freeze, that Israel, of course, will never agree to that settlement freeze, but the president is right to demand it and to insist on it. But that what he needs to do is pivot that conversation into a discussion of the borders, the final borders of the Israeli state and the Palestinian state. Continue demanding the settlement freeze, and then say, but if you're so adamant that you want to continue building, you better make a peace agreement quickly and know where your state borders are so that you can know where you're going to be building or not. And in fact, in the last 24 hours or 48 hours, there have been a flurry of news articles about Mitchell strips in the Middle East in which that argument is being made by our administration. If you don't, if you want to, you have to stop the settlement construction. You have to stop it all. And if you have such a problem with it, then let's start talking about the borders right now. And that's very, very important. The other part of the American strategy is not so high-minded, it seems, but I mean, you can see it from a realpolitik perspective, is that Palestinian governance and unity is so complicated, you can't worry about it. And therefore, we'll have a concentration on more authoritarian structures until we can get a state. And then maybe after the state, that can be opened up to more democratic structures. You're having a speaker tonight, Mustafa Wiji, who represents one of the more democratic tendency in the Palestinian leadership, a fine man and somebody who does a lot of grassroots work himself. And you'll hear from him, I'm sure, a little bit about that. So this doesn't mean now that all of this is high-minded and the era of interests and political considerations aren't necessary. The Obama administration is, in fact, of course, very concerned about how they're going to sell this in the United States, what support they're going to have in the United States, who's going to be with them, who's going to try to attack them, and how are the people who are going to attack them trying to attack them. And this is where all of you come in, and this is where CMEP comes in, and this is where Foundation for Middle East Peace and every other group that's working on this comes in. The question is, who's going to back up the president and how? And the first line of attack, probably by the Licudists and by the people who support the continued colonization of the West Bank, is going to come through Congress, our Congress, the U.S. Congress, because that's probably where the most work has been done in lobbying and preparing people to be pro-Licudists. And it's not going to come necessarily from American Jewish groups. So don't just imagine AIPAC, don't just put up AIPAC. It's going to come from Christian Zionist groups as well. And that's where there's going to need to be a backup by everybody here. That's where you've got to go back to your constituents, you've got to go back to your churches, you've got to go back to your communities and your flocks, and you've got to actually speak to them about developing very quickly in short order a constituency that lets them know that you have no tolerance for anybody who's going to attack American national security interests in that way. You have no tolerance for anybody who's going to attack peace in that way. There's also a need, in my opinion, to back up Palestinian Democrats. Not just those who supported past and present U.S. policy, but those who by necessity must be part of the Palestinian political framework. Now that's not maybe as direct an issue, but they need the support. They need the backing. And people in Congress and in the administration need to know that we're not necessarily looking for a solution that creates an Arab state that looks like an authoritarian Arab state surrounding it. We're looking for a state that's pluralistic, that represents and reflects the pluralism, the ethnic pluralism, the religious pluralism that has historically been Palestine. And there's a need to emphasize a fairness and justice narrative for both Israelis and Palestinians. In the past, and I've been part of this, so I take blame for this too, and I think Daniel's been part of it, so Daniel has to be blamed too. In the past, we've tried to trade elements. We've talked about refugees for borders. We've talked about security for independence. We've talked about symbolism for sovereignty. We've talked about settlements for land swaps. And there's no reason to believe that even with the best intentioned administration, we don't slide back into that kind of a debate and that kind of a discussion right away. And the issue of justice and fairness could get lost. There isn't a reason why within each of these issues you can't have a win-win situation. It's just a question of creativity. There's no reason why on the issue of refugees you can't have something where at least a good percentage of the refugees find to be a fair and just solution, while at the same time respecting Israel's concern that its polity remain unaffected by demographic changes. It's not impossible to imagine settlers having their attachment to Judea and Samaria. They're not attached to Tel Aviv. Like Daniel, I think Tel Aviv is one of the most coolest, hippest cities in the world, if they would only treat me like I was an equal. But the people, a lot of the people who are living in the West Bank don't actually consider Tel Aviv holy. They consider Hebron holy. They consider Nablus holy. And they consider that the part of the land that they need to stay in. Well, there's no reason that we can't consider a way where settlers can also have access to what they consider to be holy, while at the same time respecting Palestinian independence. So that, I think, is something, those are the three things that I think that as a community we can actually start to wrap our heads around and start advocating to different communities. So what's our time frame? Well, nothing's going to get easier with more time. It's not going to get better if we wait until Obama's second term. It's not going to get better if we wait until, as Netanyahu argued, until the United States, after Obama run, then we can talk about peace. That's not going to happen either, and that's not going to make it easier. Some Arab governments are pushing for an agreement by the end of the year. General Dayton, who's in charge of developing the Palestinian security forces, and it's interesting to note that in Palestine they refer to as Dayton's forces, not the Palestinian forces. General Dayton has noted that his Palestinian security forces will only remain coherent for about 18 to 24 months if there's no independent state within that time. I think that that's right. Negotiations with Iran. We're obviously not going to have, as difficult as that issue is, we're not going to make too much movement on it if we have a disaster continuing in the Israeli-Palestinian front. The withdrawal from Iraq is supposed to take place in 16 months. We have a very ambitious time frame for the things we're trying to accomplish in the Middle East. This has got to be part of it. We have 18 to 24 months. It doesn't mean the world ends in 24 months, but it does mean that the window that we have to affect change, the window that we have to try to end this conflict is right now, from right now to 24 months. And I want to just end here by saying, I know this is a lot of work, and it actually requires a personal commitment, and an emotional commitment, and I think a spiritual commitment that can take a lot out of people and out of their families. But I want you to imagine what it might look like 2 years from now. I want you to imagine 22 Arab states opening up embassies in West Jerusalem, in the Israeli capital, as well as countries all over the world opening up their embassies in East Jerusalem on the Arab side of Jerusalem. I want you to imagine that the Palestinians who've been caged in Gaza all their lives have freedom of movement and are able to move out of Gaza and into the West Bank, into Europe, into Egypt, but are able to travel just like any human being anywhere in the world. I want you to imagine Israel that not only is safe and secure because of its 300 nuclear weapons and because of its the fourth most powerful army in the world, etc., but because it actually has acceptance from all of the countries of the region. President Obama gave the most eloquent defense of the Jewish narrative, of the Zionist narrative for a Jewish homeland when he spoke in Cairo that's ever been given to a Muslim audience. Now, that's the beginning process. Imagine the end process. Imagine that the United States is not viewed in the Middle East as a colonizer, occupier, or supporter of a conflict, but if we're actually seen as a liberator and as a peacemaker. And imagine Palestinians from the diaspora, from all over the world, including Palestinian Christians, the overwhelming majority who are outside of Palestine today. Imagine them going home. Imagine them returning to their home and living out the rest of their lives, practicing their faith on the land that Jesus walked, home, free and independent. Imagine Jerusalem and its holy sites open to everybody and sanctified. The city is sanctified because there's peace. Now, that's a vision, and that's a dream that I try to remind myself of. I know there are many Israelis who can't imagine this dream, and I know there are many Palestinians too jaded to believe it can come true. So then, as Americans, let us be charitable enough to share that dream with them. Thank you.
Amjad, thank you for that inspiration. I did mention that Amjad was an advisor to the Palestinian Authority's negotiating team in the latter years of the Oslo peace process, so he comes with real expertise. Another new and important voice in the debate here in this country is that of Daniel Levy, an Israeli who has a long deep experience in peacemaking. Daniel was an advisor to Prime Minister Barak. He was an advisor to Minister of Justice Yossi Beilin. He was one of the leaders in the Geneva Accord Initiative. And he has been tireless traveling around the world in describing this conflict and advocating a way out of it. Daniel, together with Amjad, is a co-director of the Near East initiative of the Foundation for New America. He is also a fellow at the Century Foundation. Daniel, thank you. I'm sorry that you were delayed. We're glad you're here. Over to you.
Well, I'd first of all like to thank CMEP for giving me this platform and forum for your ongoing work, and Julie for the phenomenal efforts that she undertakes here in Washington, and her work at CMEP now become part of what's a really quite effectively coordinated, integral coalition of Arab American groups, Jewish American groups, Christian groups, and others trying to promote forthcoming American intervention to advance peace, and not just the peace process here in Washington. I apologize for being late. I apologize, Ambassador Wilcox, for missing your words earlier. I had something of a transportational meltdown this morning, and I wouldn't have come here this morning at all if it weren't that there were two messages that I really wanted to impart to this room. The problem is Amjad left no space. Normally, when Amjad and myself are speaking together, I'll say, well, you didn't actually leave me much to say if I'm going first. He, of course, says the same to me if I've gone first. This is one of those occasions where the not much has acquired infinitesimal proportions. But because I really would endorse everything I've just said. And in our think tank capacity at the New American Foundation, really our bread and butter day in, day out work is there's a commitment here from an administration. There's a raising of a bar of expectation. Well, we believe you can do it, and here's how. And the here's how really matters. And I think Amjad really outlined that here's how you can do it. And that's the work that we're going to be trying to advance all the time. But the second message, and I will talk a little bit about that, but the second message, which is also following on from Amjad, which meant that I really couldn't miss being at this conference, is to really share with you my own sense of the urgency and of the opportunity that we have at this very particular moment in time. That places a great burden on us. And I would say, especially on the people in this room, you're the people who took time out to be here, to be in Washington. You have communities, constituencies, congregations, organizations that you're tied into. And it's going to take the people who are here, educating themselves, giving of their time to move this in the period ahead. I'd even say something which in terms of organization and constituency building, is probably a naughty thing to say, which is I think we've got to cut corners in this next period. Let's inflate ourselves beyond what we really are. If it requires a bit of smoke and mirrors, then so be it. Because this is the time. And we will have an awfully long time, I fear, if this next period does not deliver, to talk about, and I'm not saying these are agendas that one doesn't promote in this next period, but to talk about how to improve the daily situation. There's a political solution out there, and there's a moment where we may actually get to do that. And if you can end the occupation, and I think the terminology of two states works in this respect. A way to give Palestinians, to give Israelis, to give the Christian communities in the Holy Land a very, very different prospect for the future. If we can end the occupation, there'll still be much to do. There'll still be things to implement. You should continue to be very concerned about what happens and how Christian communities in both Israel and the future Palestinian state are related to. And there'll be much work in that respect. We can do the huge breakthrough, game-changing moment of ending the occupation and getting two states. And why I'm hopeful is the two things that we've seen already. The first one is that this administration has unflinchingly defined why does it make a priority of getting peace and a two-state solution in the American interest. Now obviously I'm here and Phil talked about my background, and yes, I can give part of the kosher certificate. This is good for Israelis, and it's good for the Jewish future, and it's good for the Jewish community here. And I'll do that. But winning the argument in this country is going to have to be about this not being a favor to our ally Israel, and it not being a favor to the long-suffering Palestinians, even though both of those things are very legitimate considerations. for me, actually, my main consideration, being an Israeli. But the argument that I think we're in a stronger position to win than before, because it's being made by the president, is why this matters to America. And I think this gives you fantastic tools to go back and organize and build constituency around. And that was something the president said in Cairo. It's something he said elsewhere. Why? By the way, he's not the only one or the first one to say it, but it's the emphasis from day one of a presidency on this point that I think is in many ways so liberating for the conversation in this country. Rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, I think maybe not justifiably, actually. This is the iconoclastic litmus test issue for so much of how Arab and Muslim communities around the world view you, view your country, view your policies, view your government. Thankfully, Amjad left an anecdote from the trip in Gaza that I didn't go on, because as an Israeli I'm not allowed into Gaza. But I was waiting for them to return, and we had members of Congress with us from their time inside Gaza. And the story that one of the members told was of the kids prevalent everywhere, running around saying, F-16, F-16, Ameriki, Ameriki. That doesn't take much translation. The way in which America has become the facilitator, the enabler of the ongoing occupation, how, as Amjad said, how discrediting this is for America's allies, and how empowering it is for those who wish to do Americans harm, is dramatic. By the way, it was one of the key elements of logic of the Iraq study group, of those 10 wise, 9 wise men and a woman, led by Jim Baker and Lee Hamilton, that produced its report almost 3 years ago now, which said if we want to change the dynamics, the atmosphere, the environment in which we're operating in the Middle East, as we try to stabilize the region, stabilize Iraq, we have to get back into the business of Arab-Israeli peacemaking. We can't say, well, once we've created a model society in Iraq and Baghdad, then everyone will get on board for making Middle East peace. It's not a coincidence that the most radical groups, and here one of the crucial things that happened in Cairo last week, is a return to sanity in terms of how one looks at the world of Islam and that political Islam. A return to sanity by not using those worn-out phrases, moderates and terrorists, by saying there are violent extremists, and then there's everyone else, and everyone else includes the political Islamists that America doesn't talk to at the moment. But if one wants to rally hostility to the United States, there's no better flag, there's no more resonant issue than the Palestinian issue. And I think that's why it's so crucially in an American interest to address this. And to the extent to which that can be echoed and explained and constituency can be built around that message, and that's something that CMEP does, and a friend who I also want to acknowledge who's here, Greg Khalil, and the work that he's doing in trying to move that argument along. Because you know, we read a lot of articles, and there was a piece in the New York Times yesterday talking about where is Nida Lowy and Howard Berman and Gary Ackerman, who are all members of the Congress who come from the American Jewish community. Are they going to stand behind the president on settlements? And I understand. But one looks to the Jewish leadership for leadership on this issue. And that's important. And I'm involved in another initiative called J Street, which is about bringing to bear the fact that the majority of American Jews, surprise, surprise, carry their liberal values into this arena as well, but they're not heard enough. It's the minority of the community that's fighting for the settlements and against peace. But this isn't only our fight. This isn't a fight between liberal Jews and pro-settlement Likud Jews in America over the heart and soul of American Middle East policy. With respect to you, you have a dog in this fight. There's an American interest there. And to be perfectly blunt, we can't win this fight on our own. Nor should we, of course, have to. Especially given what's happened here in the last 20 years, which has radically changed the conversation. Because as soon as you add the capacity to mobilize so many in the Christian evangelical Zionist community around this issue, it's totally not a fair fight anymore if no one else is mobilized. You suddenly have a domestic constituency that's not Jewish American, not Arab American, not Palestinian American. And if there's not a counterbalance to that, I don't see how even this president, with his determination, and I think with his good intentions, succeeds. The second thing that makes me hopeful is that they've taken this route of speaking truth to friends and holding up a mirror to friends. That includes of course, Israel. As Amjad said, I think it was incredibly powerful to have the president go to Cairo in the speech billed as the speech to the Muslim world, as the speech to the Arab world, and make the points that he made about why Israel exists and the legitimacy of that. I think that was an incredibly powerful point, and I don't think it was lost on Israelis. By the way, much of the Israeli Prime Minister was probably squirming as he listened to the speech. At least it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon in Israel, so he didn't have to be up at 6 o'clock in the morning to squirm. But I think the Israeli public were viewing this far, far more favorably. America has historically encouraged the very worst of tendencies in my adopted country. I'm not speaking Israeli English, in case you thought this is North London. At the age of 21, I moved to Israel. American policy has until now encouraged the worst tendencies. And I really do draw the analogy to someone who's had several too many drinks. And rather than saying enough is enough, I'll drive you home, is encouraged to have one more for the road and here at the house keys. That's the story of American policy towards settlements and towards so much that is now coming back to haunt Israel. And so many of the things, by the way, that Arik Asherman, who I see here, the rabbis for human rights, on a daily basis, are trying to change that. But we've reached a crisis point in Israel, I believe at least. And it's not a question of equivalence and you know, this ridiculous notion of what we should be most angry about. I mean, Golda Meir's famous, ridiculous saying of, was it Golda Meir? It was, I think one thing we can never forgive you for is forcing us to do the things that we've had to do to secure Israel against the Palestinians. But one piece of truth there is what 42 years of occupation have done to Israeli society. I'll let you into a secret. Our 19-year-old kids aren't any worse than yours. When our 19-year-old kids are standing at a checkpoint and have the power, literally sometimes, of life, there will be.
kids. It's irresponsible to have placed them in that position. The responsibility is the government that placed them in that position. Now, sure, they have individual responsibility. And I'm very worried about what's happening in Israeli society. But it's a society that will continue to drive itself over a cliff if we don't pull ourselves back from the brink of ending the occupation. So for me, by the way, and like I say, this doesn't have to be the driving motivation. But for me, by the way, this really is about saving the soul of Israel. This really is the most, to reclaim an over-abused phrase, this really is the most pro-Israel thing one can possibly do until we can get past that contradiction of pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian. Honestly, since I've been in the United States, probably the most scary self-definition that anyone can give themselves often is, I'm pro-Israel and, because normally it means terrible things now. We have to reclaim that. Pro-Israel is not allowing Israel to continue its acts of self-destruction. Which takes me to settlements and settlement growth. And Amjad referred to this, and I just want to talk about it for a minute or two. Israel has not built any new settlements declaratively since 1993. Just so you know. So as part of this debate we're told that Israel has accepted no new settlements. It's only building in the already built up areas. We are 16 years into a policy of no new settlements. The number of Israelis living in the West Bank when that policy began in 1993, because it's not polite if you're in a peace process to build new settlements, right? So we couldn't say that we're building any new settlements. The number of Israelis in the West Bank when that policy began in 1993 was 111,000. The number of Israelis in the West Bank today is 290,000. For a policy of no new settlements. So natural growth is everything. Everything that has happened has been so-called natural growth. And if you're a government, you have responsibilities. I'm sure many of you would love to have your kids live next door or in an apartment above your existing apartment. I'm not sure all your kids would. You probably live in places where there are planning and zoning restrictions and regulations, where you can't build wherever you want. There are green areas. There are public areas. There are sometimes restrictions in how high buildings can go. Why should it be the case that one place in the world that doesn't apply to is Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria? But this is the argument that we're going to hear. This is going to be a fight. Fight has been entered into in many ways already. By the way, no one is mentioning yet whether it applies to East Jerusalem. And that's going to be the key, in addition to everything else. I think in a way, smartly, we're not talking about East Jerusalem yet. Because at the moment, at least we can claim, well, obviously it has to apply to East Jerusalem as well. But it's going to be a serious issue once that needs to be clarified. And for me, that's at the core of this holding a mirror up and acting like a friend to it. So those are my two reasons for hope. The big question for me is whether there's the gumption to get it done. Now, I would argue that it can be done, and I'm not going to repeat the things that Amjad said. As Amjad said, I would pivot from this conversation on settlements to a conversation on borders. The issue of Palestinian capacity can be addressed. This can't be left to the parties in bilateral negotiations. One of the things being discussed now is we've got to get the parties together again. We've got to get the parties talking to each other. Like the settlement issue, that's fine, as long as it's understood to be a pivot. What do I mean by that? You have the settlement conversation, I believe, in order to be able to turn around to the Israeli government and say, we realize how difficult and painful this is for you, because these are real communities. We understand that. The table over here marked limits to our settlement freeze demand, / where you're still allowed to build, we're actually not willing to sit down at that table. Because the American position at that table has been said, and it's one line, and it's freeze means freeze. So there's no conversation at that table. But there's another table there in the other end of the room, which is marked delineating a permanent status border for Palestine and for Israel. If you want to talk about some of these places close to the Green Line, if you want to talk about a land swap, if you want to talk about one-to-one exchange of territory that modifies the 67 line, we're not going to have that conversation over there. We'll have that conversation over there. That's the only place we'll have that conversation. Likewise, it may be smart to say to the parties, you've got to get back to negotiating, but only in the following way. To know that when they reach an impasse, and they'll reach an impasse, by the way, depending on how much nice talk, small talk there is, my name's Benjamin Netanyahu, America, 10 minutes into the conversation. And they'll pretend, of course, they didn't reach an impasse immediately. But as long as once there's an acknowledged impasse, America is the one driving this forward. And here's what I'd say about why isn't Israel making these choices on their own? And just as Amjad's disclosure, so my disclosure, I was an official Israeli negotiator in the peace talks in the past. And I'd say the following. Ultimately, these are political choices. And America holds in its hand the capacity to change that balance. The cost-benefit equation, because Prime Minister Netanyahu will give a speech next Sunday. And what you've seen in the last 10 years is Israeli political leaders, often of the centre-right, reaching the Prime Minister's office and saying, okay. Either now I have to pretend that I'm in favour of a two-state solution that's in some way dignified and legitimate, or genuinely believing it. I would put Ariel Sharon in the former category and Ehud Olmert in the latter category. But they've never actually gone ahead and done anything about it. And Netanyahu will probably say something to that effect next Sunday. Now, I think the reason they never came close to doing anything about it is because they looked out across their domestic political landscape and they said, it's a bit difficult. Settler community, large. Right-wing community, large. The ultra-Orthodox are now against this kind of dispensation. And what was going on the other side? On the other side of that cost-benefit equation, virtually nothing. All you had to do was say two states. All you had to do was be in a negotiation. The negotiation didn't have to go anywhere. You could be building settlements at a furious pace at the same time. But all you had to do was be part of this make-believe process, and everything was okay. Our relations with Europe improved, our relations with the United States, of course, went swimmingly. There wasn't a cost to prevarication, to continuing to build settlements while talking, etc. And politicians, amongst other things, are in the business of every day making decisions and calculations on the basis of cost-benefit equations. And the only way to redress that balance is if one sticks to this honest conversation between the United States and Israel. I actually think it's demeaning to Israeli governments not to acknowledge Israel is a democracy, yes, but a democracy that is so skewed by the decisions that you make here. What other democratic country has the most important ally in the world? Basically, takes the a regular basis. Basically says, okay, we'll say on paper that we're committed to this, but we don't really do it. Doesn't get called on it. And you don't expect that to affect our conversation in Israel? Again, it's our responsibility at the end of the day. I'm desperately unhappy about what's going on inside Israel. We need to win as a peace camp, but we at least have to acknowledge that we're being cut off at the knees, day in, day out, by American decision makers, and by extension by the American public. Only if America's having an honest conversation with Israel do you create the conditions where Israelis can begin to have an honest conversation with each other. And that's why one of the this is probably the worst place in Gallaudet in the US to say this, but when we were with some Israeli former senior military people, Amjad and myself, a couple of weeks ago, one of them said, you know how you whisper to an Israeli? You stand on the table and shout. And there are so many benefits for Israel, which is why I think that if the real choices are put on the table, first of all, I'm convinced the Israeli public makes the right choice. If it's a real choice, an eminently reasonable two-state dispensation that gives real dignity to the Palestinians, security for Israel in legitimate ways of addressing our legitimate concerns. Not security as a land grab, not security as demeaning the sense of sovereignty of the Palestinian state, but real security solutions, which may involve you, by the way. If a dignified, eminently reasonable two-state solution and a comprehensive peace deal involving Syria, involving Lebanon, involving our other neighbours, involving the Arab Peace Initiative, if that is put on the table, I have no doubt where the Israeli public goes. I have doubt as to where Israel's current political leaders go, but that's a good thing, because the obvious answer would be, well, they'll clearly be against. But I don't think they would be clearly against if they're faced with that real choice. And in this respect, this is why, by the way, the Arab Peace Initiative is so important. And Amjad said it's getting to yes. And I always say, when you've had a very, very long argument or feud with someone in your own personal life, and that person, say, turns around and says, you know what, fine, we'll do it that way. Paradoxically, that can actually be quite an unsatisfying moment. Because what you want the person to say is, no, it's not just the practical outcome. I want you to acknowledge that my narrative was right all along, and your arguments were fundamentally flawed for the last 20 years. You don't tend to get that. Not in personal life, and also apparently not in political life. So we've gotten as much of a yes as we can get. Unfortunately, it places the burden, everything Amjad and myself, and I've missed what Phil said, but I can't believe that it something similar. It places something of a burden on this place. And again, it does not mean that we do not have responsibilities for what goes on the ground. I think it's acknowledgement, though, of a political reality of where this conflict is. And that, in turn, means that once you've heard some fabulous people who I know are coming to speak to you during the rest of today, and you leave here, and Julie hounds you to do things, and Warren and others, what I started off by saying, this is a moment, and I think it's a several month, so maybe it's a year, 2-year commitment, where we're going to know whether this administration goes for it or not. And I don't need you to tell me that one of the things they're going to be looking at is the numbers. That's what we've got to create. And as I'm suggesting, just as importantly, create a sense of that this matters to people, there's constituency out there, and there's people who are actually going to be sufficiently moved to lobby, write letters, put together meetings, campaign online, campaign offline, support candidates, withhold their support from candidates, speak to publicly elected officials, bring speakers to congregations, all of those things. And this is the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you again, Amjad. We have just a quick 15 minutes for questions. Are there questions on cards, or shall I just recognize raised hands? You'd like some cards? I'm not surprised that there are many questions here on Jerusalem, an issue which CMEP has taken the lead. Let me ask both of the panelists for quick thoughts on solutions that may be emerging or not emerging for Jerusalem.
I'm going to let Daniel go first so that I can answer.
There are two Jerusalems to relate to in responding to that kind of question. One is the old city, and perhaps the area immediately around the old city, places of religious, spiritual significance that affected communities. And then there's the rest. That Jordanian Jerusalem really was pretty much limited to that, to the old city and its environs. The rest, I see as part of the territorial solution. In other words, there should be a border which, for reasons of realpolitik, allows for modifications of the 67 rights. And that would apply in Jerusalem as well, and there should be a clear one-to-one land swap and exchange of territories, and that should be a minimal modification of those 67 rights. But I think that the 12 or 13, the reason I say or 13 is whether one includes Har-Hama, Jabal or not. Neighborhoods built over the Green Line in what Israel considers to be municipal Jerusalem will be part of that new territorial delineation. In other words, that will be part of Israel, that will be land given in exchange. But that means that most of the land around Jerusalem, the land around Jerusalem and what will be Palestine has to be Palestinian. So all the area leading up to now, etc. For those of you who follow this that would have to be the Palestinians. In terms of the old city and its immediate environs, this is where I don't think we've fully thought through all the creative options that are available. I think there'd have to be an international role. I think there'd have to be respect for the religious sites. I think there would have to be an added Israeli footprint when it comes to the Western Wall, and an added Palestinian footprint when it comes to the Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. But I think here there'll have to be a significant degree of cooperation, of openness, and of internationalization.
I have no less than 5 questions about whether the U.S. should influence Israeli government policy by withholding or conditioning U.S. economic and military aid to Israel on the basis of the Israeli government's cooperation in working toward an end to the occupation of the settlements, shared Jerusalem and two-state peace. Would either of you like to tackle that one?
I mean, I think the answer to those things is tactical. It's the question is, what are the Israelis responding to? What's working? And if it gets to the point where you're talking about those kinds of things, it means that the Israelis have decided to dig in their heels to and the government of Israel knows that it's going to lose in face of re-election. I mean, if it gets to the point where it tells the United States States no, 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 and the United States is then forced to say there's got to be a price for somebody telling us publicly no 50 times in 1 month. And so I think there are an entire host of measures that the United States can take in quick measure. And I think the President and the Secretary of State have already begun that process by being so clear and forthright publicly about what U.S. demands and what U.S. national interests demand. That in many ways is far more valuable than getting into the military aid budget or getting into the money that goes to Israel. Now, I would make one differentiation on that, though. There are many Christian and Jewish groups in the United States that have 501c3 status that raise money specifically for settlements. And those can be ended immediately. The President can put the same restrictions on those that he's put on Muslim American organizations that raise money and then the United States found out that they were going to, or the United States, in many cases alleged, in some cases proved that money was going to groups that the United States considered terrorist organizations. So I put them in the same camp. I think those organizations you can shut down right away. Once it was clear that America, and then there's also, I think there may be questions of legal liability of Americans who are participating actively in the settlement enterprise. And so I think there are lots of things that you can do before you get to the question of the military aid.
All I'd add to that is that in terms of winning the conversation politically with Israel, I think if one can be in a place where America says, we are 100% with your legitimate security needs, and in that part of the world, having a qualitative military edge may be a very reasonable ask. We care about your security. We're going to draw our red line at your green line. So I think you begin to lose the conversation in Israel, given that the assistance, the military, it's all military assistance now. In years to come, where that will stand, I don't know. But I think that's one way of losing the conversation there. The second thing I'd say is go for things that you can win. The military assistance is appropriated by Congress. Like I say, I think it's the wrong direction to go in. I also think it's really a fruitless exercise. If we can keep Congress on board, not to go against the administration on the settlement freeze, I think we're doing well. So what I'd add to that is that there are many, many measures one can take, which I think are understood as not undermining Israel's security by Israelis, and that can either be done by executive order, can be done by the executive branch, or you could actually carry Congress with you. And that's where I'd focus. It's traditional to veto any UN Security Council resolution that's critical. Israelis would notice if there were a resolution critical on settlements that weren't vetoed. Israelis notice when Hillary Clinton appears on Stephanopoulos and said what she said yesterday about there are no previous understandings on settlement freeze. So there are very many ways of communicating things that are standing up on the table and shouting enough that they're heard.
And just to add, there's one thing, and exactly, going to the point of saying we're going to cut aid is very complex and could actually add. But there are a lot of steps that are along the way. So Ronald Reagan, for example, suspended shipments of cluster bombs to Israel in 1982 because they used them against so many civilian population centers in Lebanon in the war in 1982. The UNRWA compound in Gaza that we visited had been hit with white phosphorus that was apparently, according to the canisters that landed in the compound, made in a factory in Alabama. So there are things that the United States can do to let Israel know, our support for your security is unconditional. Our support for your military qualitative edge is unconditional. We're not going to sell you white phosphorus as long as you're using it to bomb civilians or bomb UN compounds. We're not going to sell you, and those the president can do on his own. And so those are things that you could look at.
Congress takes very seriously its prerogative as the appropriator of funds. And the Congress is likely to bring up the rear in supporting the new American peace project that will succeed. I think it will follow the president, but to launch an initiative for cutting off aid to Israel at the outset, I think it would be a terrible mistake. It would produce a year of wheel spinning, and there's no assurance that the president will succeed. And that weapon should be reserved, if for use at all, until a very late stage. That's not to say, however, that some more modest steps like those panelists mentioned. There was a successful initiative during the George H.W. Bush, Jim Baker administration for withholding funds equivalent to the amount spent on settlements. It was not sustained. It did not have sufficient drive behind it, and Bush left office. But that may be an option that could be used at some early or intermediate stage process. I have a couple of questions about how this process will unfold. Can the U.S. expect the current Israeli government to absorb and accept a strong and persistent truth-telling recommendations from the United States? Or is this going to be a messier process that might involve new elections, or a successor, or several successor governments in Israel, until the Israeli public strongly accepts the need to do this and elects a government of Israel that wants, that will do it? Given the large block of political parties in Israel that for years and years have discouraged peace initiatives and who are ideologically and religiously motivated, what's the process going to be, even if there is a prime minister who is more willing than the current prime minister to change Israeli policy in such a dramatic, sweeping way?
I mean, first and most importantly, all I'd say is we'll only find out if the administration sticks to its guns, and that will only happen if public opinion here is where it needs to be, I think. So, I mean, I think the president is saying something very smart. In one of the interviews, he said, actually, a leader like Netanyahu might find it easier to go forward and make the compromises necessary than a leader from the left. And it's something we're very familiar with, right? Nixon and China. So few Nixons find their Chinas, apparently for a reason, because people who come from that end of the political spectrum apparently aren't there by coincidence. Nevertheless, Netanyahu may make the right choice. My argument would be test that hypothesis. On the thumbnail, just jotting it down, you know, our parliament in Israel is terribly complicated, 120 seats, 12 factions at least represented. But I think to the moderate side, to the left of Likud, you have at least 55 members of the current Israeli Knesset. So theoretically, you only need 6 members of Netanyahu's party, Netanyahu plus 5 out of his 26 other members of his faction, to go the right way if Netanyahu chose to do this. The other thing I'd say is that for 10 years, literally, almost 10 years, since Netanyahu left office in 1999, Israelis have been told, or rather Israelis have told the United States, don't push us or you'll get Netanyahu. Literally, when Barak was Prime Minister, when Sharon was Prime Minister, when Olmert was Prime Minister, there was one line that would always be used between the Israeli Prime Minister's office and the White House. Be careful, you'll get Netanyahu. There's Netanyahu, and then not sure exactly what Netanyahu says. Be careful, you might get my evil twin brother. So that argument can't be used anymore, which, as I say, in a way is very liberating. Netanyahu chose to form the coalition he's formed. You'll hear all this argument. What do you expect from Netanyahu? He'll lose his coalition. He's the one that chose to form that coalition. I don't think it was ready to go to elections so quickly. The coalition in Israel may change. The real question is, does Netanyahu have to face real decisions?
We have one question which I'll answer briefly before we close. We may have inadvertently suggested that the total number of Israeli settlers is about 300,000. There are 200,000 Israelis who live in large settlements surrounding the city of East Jerusalem, especially in East Jerusalem. And that is, so there are some 500,000 altogether. And then there are another 15,000 or so that go on heights. Are the East Jerusalem settlements going to be in play in the negotiations? And what will their disposition be, or should it be altered?
I think Daniel actually answered that and commented on it. One thing that I think we should avoid doing, I mean, we'll leave it to the negotiators, or we can actually talk to the negotiators about it, but one of the problems in the past has been the idea that where there's a Jew, you plant an Israeli flag, where there's an Arab, you plant a Palestinian flag, and that's the solution for Jerusalem. And the reality, of course, is that the colonization process of Jerusalem on the 67 side has made it such that if you did that, you're going to have flags everywhere. You're going to have Palestinian flags and Israeli flags all next to each other everywhere, because people are literally colonizing right within the middle of Arab neighborhoods. I mean, they're going in and building everywhere in order to make that. If you went with that solution, if you went with the, Jews can't possibly be under Arab sovereignty and Arabs can't possibly be under Jewish sovereignty. That kind of ethnic purity model, I think we're going to have to get away from. As horrible, this is just my personal opinion, as horrible as the settlement policy has been, I'm very nervous always about massive transfers of ethnic populations. Pakistan, India, and other examples, for example. The idea of trying to move masses of people. We've got to come up with solutions that aren't based on ethnic purity. We've got to come up with solutions that respect everyone's rights and allow people to continue having a normal life, but living within the sovereignty of the state, whether it's their state or the neighboring state. And so we're going to have to come up with some creative solutions to that. But the reason that it's going to be the settlers are trying this very desperately and adamantly because they assume that if there's ever a two-state solution, it's going to be an ethnically pure one. So if they're everywhere, and if they're in every Arab neighborhood, then that part of it will have to go to Israel. And I think we've got to break I mean, it's a very un-American way of thinking about things. We don't think in terms of ethnic purity. We don't think in terms of racial purity. And borders being set based on that. And I think that when we talk about the negotiations, we have to, again, stop using an Israeli narrative or a Palestinian narrative. And I think we've got to start introducing American principles.
We've reached the end of our time. I want to thank our panelists for